Hello, my name is Joe Schmiesing. The issue that I've chosen to tackle is that of facial transplantation, the morality of facial transplants. It's a relatively new medical technology about which there is no defined church teaching. The first facial allograft transplantation, as its technical title is, only occurred in 2005, and it was a partial facial allograft transplantation. It was the work of an American team from Louisville, but because it was not permitted in the United States at that time, they went to France for a dog bite victim. The first total facial transplant was in 2010, and the first total facial transplant in the United States was not until 2015. So just last year. This is very new stuff. There's a couple of what I think are the key considerations in this question. Firstly, the Catechism teaches that organ donation is acceptable provided there is consent and that it does not cause the death of the donor. Additionally, organ transplants are in conformity with the moral law, and I quote from the Catechism, if the physical and psychological dangers and risks to the donor are proportionate to the good that is sought for the recipient. And I end the quote. That's Catechism of the Catholic Church 2296. And the reason for this is because there is always the evil of one person having their organs removed, even if they are dead. So we're always looking at a case of the principle of double effect rightly applied. So we're always looking at proportionality as part of it. The other consideration to be looked at is whether or not the face constitutes the person. Quotation, the brain and the gonads may not be transplanted because they ensure the personal and procreative identity, respectively. And that's from the Charter for Healthcare Workers, the Pontifical Council for Pastoral Assistance. So because of the personhood, those cannot be transplanted. So the central questions are going to be, do the risks, are they proportional to the good of a transplantation of a face, and is the face in the same category as the brain and gonads regarding the identity of the person? So 3 articles to look at here, none of which came from particularly Christian or Catholic sources. I couldn't find any current articles on this. I guess maybe it's because it's so new, that were written from a Christian or Catholic perspective. The first was from Adjik and Simonow, and it argued that FAT, facial allograft transplantation, is morally justifiable due to the effect upon the patient. This article is unique in a couple of ways. Firstly, it was written before facial transplantations had occurred. This would be 2005, so it's a very early article in the whole debate. And its arguments are therefore hypothetical. No facial transplantation of any kind had yet been done. Secondly, it's unique in that it argues almost exclusively regarding the proportionality of the risks and the benefits. It looks almost all at that. It really doesn't even ask the question, is the object something that we should be doing at all? And so it kind of adopts a Knauer approach where it just looks at proportionalism as the only justification. One of the things it does bring up is that facial allograft transplantation is different than a facial reconstruction. In a facial reconstruction, what is done is they may reconstruct some of the bone structure. They may graft onto the face skin from other parts of the body. This, though, if it's a total facial reconstruction, what the result is something that really doesn't resemble a human face, per se. Because the skin and tissue from other parts of the body is not facial tissue, it doesn't regenerate and grow, and doesn't have the same elasticity that facial tissue does. So the result of this would be something that doesn't actually resemble a human face. In a facial allograft transplantation, the result is something that resembles a human face because the entire facial tissue is used. So this would include the skin, but it also includes things like the hair follicles, the nerve endings, the blood vessels, even some of the subcutaneous stuff like the muscles and such, so that the end result is something that looks like a face, but it doesn't specifically actually resemble the face of the donor, because the facial structure of the recipient is still there, nor does it resemble the face of the recipient entirely, because it is in fact the facial envelope, the outside part, of the donor. So what you end up with really then is kind of like a third face. Not the face of the donor, not the face of the recipient, but yet a new facial composition. They argued that this was worth the risk because other methods of facial reconstruction actually had more risk. So these multiple reconstructive surgeries, they would argue that there were about 20 to 50 reconstructive surgeries necessary for someone who had severe facial deformation. So all of the risks of one surgery would be multiplied by 20 or 50 times, whereas with facial allograft transplantation, it would be one surgery that would encompass all of the necessary reconstruction. It did acknowledge that there were significant risks, such as lifelong, the big one is lifelong immunosuppressant use. It also, that carries with it the risk of liver failure, the risk of developing lymphoma because of it, the risk of infection, the possibility of transplant rejection. But it said that these risks were outweighed by the good, and it defined the good specifically as the relieving of the psychological suffering of lifelong isolation that facial deformity brought. So it really looked at it from a societal perspective and said, well, there's a societal pressure, so the good is a psychological good to eliminate suffering. It didn't really address the concept of a person at all, or whether this would, change the personhood that had any effect upon the identity. Freeman and Yaude, the second article, also from the same actual Journal of Medical Ethics, argued that facial transplants were not morally acceptable, largely on the same grounds. They argued that the risks did not outweigh the benefits. Sorry, that the risks did outweigh the benefits, which made it not proportional. They did also, though, they did bring up the question of the identity of the person, and I'll get into that in a second. So firstly, they started their argument by examining the effect that it had upon the recipient. And they brought up something new, which was that in all organ donors, there's kind of an acknowledgement on the part of the recipient that they have a piece of another person within themselves. They argued that this would be severely exacerbated in the case of facial transplant recipients, because they not only have a part of the person within themselves, they actually have a part of the person on themselves. That their relatable identity would be significantly changed into that of someone else. This article then also noted that the primary good was the relieving of psychological suffering, not the treatment of any specific disease. Unlike a kidney transplant that might treat a disease, an illness of the kidney, this doesn't treat an illness. It relieves suffering. Psychological suffering, not actually physical suffering. And they argued that other methods would be less invasive in relieving psychological suffering than a facial transplant. And those other methods carried no risks whatsoever. Another interesting point that they brought up was that there's a strong willingness among the people who need facial transplants to accept whatever risk. They're willing to accept any risk whatsoever because the psychological suffering is so strong. However, those who are most able to cope with the suffering are those who are least likely to ask for a facial transplant. These would also be the people who would be most likely to be able to cope with the psychological suffering of having a transplant. So they argue that those who would actually be able to take it are the ones who never ask for it. And those who are least likely to be able to take it are the ones who most ask for it. Thus kind of creating sort of like the worst possible situation. And they brought up, like the other article, that the person who receives it will neither look like themselves before their facial problem, nor will they look like the donor, but they will have a composite appearance that is entirely new. They also then they brought up the idea of how integral is the face to the human person and their identity. They weren't approaching it from a Christian or Catholic perspective, but they did kind of make the argument that if we say that a face is not integral to the person, then we're saying that body is not integral to the person. And we run the risk then of creating sort of the Mr. Potato Head mentality, like it doesn't matter what pieces I put together, as long as I'm intact, my body doesn't really matter. And they argued that this would be a threat to the dignity of the human person. They also brought up the question of the freedom of the donor. Unlike typical organ donation, which is agreed to usually ahead of time by the donor cards and things of this nature, facial transplantation is not yet on any of the donor cards. Thus, every facial transplant that has occurred so far has not been agreed to by the person donating that organ, but rather by their family for them on their behalf or in their stead, because they were unable to agree to anything at the time. And they question whether this meets the criteria of the donor freely choosing to donate, at which point it doesn't become donation anymore. And so if that were the case, then it would clearly be morally unacceptable, because we can't have organ donation that we take from someone. It's no longer donation. They also asked the question of organ allocation. Who gets these donations? It's kind of a separate topic which has its own moral problems, which is worth studying at some point in time. Unlike typical organ donation where the sickest person would be in the front of the line, in this case, there's not a sickness, so what is the criteria that we say who's going to get the first donation based upon? It ends up being sort of arbitrary criteria, or they argue it ends up being cost-based. So the person who is wealthiest gets the first face. And if you're poor, you're out of luck. The third article was the least helpful. It didn't bring up much new stuff. It was mostly sort of a history of the organ transplantation. This was from Brown and other authors in the International Journal of Surgery. And I think they tended to approach it mostly from a surgical perspective. Their evaluation was that we wouldn't be able to really know the necessary moral issues until we had done more of these surgeries. So they said we had to keep doing the surgeries so that we could figure out what the moral and ethical problems were. Which they of course said the risk is going to be worth the benefit because the rate of rejection is low, only 13%, so only 13% of the faces get rejected. And they just ignored entirely the question of personhood. They were mostly concerned with the donor's freedom and their family and how that would all work, and whether or not you'd have a closed casket or open casket, and whether or not the person would be able to psychologically handle the pressure and what effect it would have upon society. In conclusion, I borrowed from Dr. Leon Kass and others, and that question of personal identity still seems to me the unanswered one, because this would be, what am I actually choosing in the action? And it seems to me like Grisey would argue that what I'm choosing here is a facial transplant, which must be acknowledged as a different object than tissue transplant, generally speaking. And so it would carry its own object and its own moral considerations. With that being said, I would argue that the face is not the same thing as the identity of the person. It's not comparative to the brain and the gonads. Because if my face were defigured, it would not mean that I was less of a person or that I was a different person. And therefore, if I received a facial transplant, it would not change my identity in a significant way. Thank you.